Hey there, my name is Chris Acton with Acting Creative, and this is a handwoven experience. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about a warp-faced fabric. Now, if you caught the episode right before this, I introduced the idea of a weft-faced fabric, and they're basically two sides of the same coin. In every piece of handwoven fabric, you need a warp and a weft. They always have to work together to create the fabric. However, in a warp-faced fabric or a weft-faced fabric, that one component is the star of the show. Like, it is all about either the warp or the weft. So there's some things to keep in mind as you create a warp-faced fabric. So I've got just a couple suggestions to help you create some really successful warp-faced fabric. Suggestion number one is to move your warp yarns really close. Now, if the point of the fabric is to highlight the warp, that is the star of the show, we want those warp yarns to be shoulder to shoulder, close together, buddy up. They are really, really tight. So I suggest that no matter what your regular set is for this kind of fiber, double it. That sounds really close, doesn't it? But that is going to give you the best results if you're going to highlight just your warp yarns, right? So suggestion number one is to move your warp yarns just really, really close to each other. The idea is not to see the weft at all, really. Suggestion number two is to consider your design. Now, in a normal woven fabric, you are considering both the warp and the weft because you're going to see a little of both. That's typically how we organize it and plan for it. But in a warp-faced fabric, you are only going to see the warp. So we have to think about the design a little differently, right? We only have one direction of yarn to create an interesting fabric. So let me share kind of how I did mine here. I currently have shafts 1 and 3 lifted. And when I do that, I have this like royal purple, and then I have this kind of marigold-ish stripe in the middle, right? See what happens when I switch my shafts to just the opposite. Okay, check that out. So now I have this like burgundy color on the outside, and my inside stripe is like Halloween orange. So I designed it so that I have drastically different things happening when I lift different shafts. And you can play with this completely, but just keep in mind that if all of your warp yarns look like this, you're not going to get a lot of interest in the design. So give that some thought, my friends. Suggestion number 3 actually has to do with the weft. And my suggestion is this: have two wefts to play with. Here is why. If you have, say, a really fine weft, look at this guy. This is like just an 8-2 cotton. And you are just using this one shuttle to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You are going to create very, very tiny stripes that are alternating, right? But your eyeball is just going to blend those guys together. So while you can absolutely play with that, you're not getting the most bang for your buck here. So let's look at the opposite. What if you have a weft that is nice and chunky, like it's got some heft to it, right? Well, if you have a weft like this, it's really going to push up these yarns, and that's what you're going to see more of, right? When this guy goes through, you see like a tiny little fraction of the warp, but when this one goes through, you see, 1/8 of an inch. Awesome. Now, if you think of just using the chunky one alone, it's just going to alternate back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, right? And that's not a bad thing. You can see more of it, highlights it, great. But my suggestion is to use them both. Use 2 wefts when you're playing with a warp-faced fabric, because then you can really choose what you're going to highlight and for how long. Imagine if I am going along and I want this burgundy option to be on top. Well, I'm going to send the chunky one through, followed by my fine one, and back to the chunky one so that this one will stay on top. I've got an example for you. You can see right here what that can look like. Now, as you see, it is still highlighting just the warp, but the weft plays this really key role in supporting it and making the design. Okay, so my last suggestion is kind of a bonus suggestion because the truth is it applies to both the warp-faced fabric and the weft-faced fabric. And here it is, pad your take-up. Now, have you heard the word take-up before, that phrase? Take-up refers to the amount of inches that you will lose in each warp yarn because the weft is in there pushing it out of the way. Does that make sense? Let me explain it for you. So let's say that each of my warp yarns here are 3 yards long. That is the length of it, right? Now, you know, because we have waste, we have other things happening, we are not actually gonna be able to weave a 3-yard project with each warp yarn being 3 yards, right? We lose some. Well, Takeup is going to subtract some inches as well. What that means is that, imagine, see my little row right here? Every time I put in that chunky weft, that warp yarn has to go farther up and farther down to make room for the weft. So I am losing little fractions of inches every time I put in that really chunky weft, right? Same applies when we have a WarpFaced fabric. I recommend that you have something nice and bold and probably beefier, right? So your warp yarns have to travel farther up and down as you are creating your fabric, meaning that you are losing inches faster than normal. So I normally would pad my project, say 1 inch per 1 foot. If I want to have a project that is a certain length, I will just add extra inches normally. For this type of project, a WarpFaced project, I would probably at least double that because you are just losing inches faster, right? Your 3 yards are quickly becoming shorter and shorter because the weft is pushing it up and over with each pick. Hope that helps. Hope that makes sense as you're thinking about planning for a WarpFaced project or a WarpFaced project in this case. So let's review the suggestions I have for our WarpFaced fabric. First of all, move those warp yarns a lot closer together. They're the star of the show and we need to see all of them. Number 2 is to consider the design. You only have the warp to highlight here. So really think about when you're lifting and lowering your shafts, what do you want to show up? Number 3, use 2 wefts. That's really going to give you so many design options and help you highlight the yarns that you want to when you want to. And the bonus is to pad your take-up. Give yourself more inches to accommodate the fact that you're going to be working with a chunky weft as one of your options. Okay, friends, it's so much fun. And if you haven't had a chance to play with a WarpFaced fabric, it is a good time for sure. Let me know in the comments if you've had an opportunity to do maybe a little rep weave, which is a classic WarpFaced fabric. And how was your experience? Did you enjoy it? It forces your brain to think just a little bit differently, which I always like. All right, friends, have a wonderful week. Happy weaving.